At 11 a.m., August 4th, 1892, in Fall River, Massachusetts, Bridget Sullivan, maid to the Borden family, was resting in her bedroom in the attic of the house after a hard morning cleaning the windows both on the inside and outside, all the while feeling extremely ill. Her moment of rest was disturbed by cries from the youngest Borden daughter, Lizzie, who called out to her.
"Maggie, come down quick. Father's dead. Somebody came in and killed him."
Dashing downstairs, Bridget would see that on the couch of the living room lay the family patriarch, Andrew Borden, clearly brutalized and no longer with the living. It would only be half an hour later that Bridget and a neighbor would find the stepmother of the family, Abby, face down in the guest bedroom, having suffered much the same fate as her husband around 90 minutes prior to him. Ensuing events would have the police eventually aiming their finger at, shockingly enough, the daughter that found her father's corpse, Lizzie Borden. And so this case would become the trial of the century, not only for Fall River, Massachusetts, but for the nation as a whole. It would coin the famous rhyme, Lizzie Borden took an axe, gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, gave her father 41. And yet, after a whirlwind trial of media hoaxes, suspicious testimonies, and the possible destruction of key evidence, she was found, surprisingly enough, not guilty. And yet, here we are, 132 years later, still wondering who did it and whether Lizzie played a part. Now, the case has been depicted and adapted many a time, with Lizzie having been played in movies by Christina Ricci, Chloe Sevigny, and Elizabeth Montgomery, who actually was Lizzie's sixth cousin once removed. But in all of these, and indeed the majority of fictionalized accounts, she is shown to be the murderer. Though the exact reasons may vary from cold-blooded greed to desperation for escape to the occasional supernatural or eldritch force. This pre-rendered verdict is not an exception in stage adaptations either, including a ballet from 1948 that actually amended history to give her a guilty verdict, the musical New Faces of 1952 having a campy hoedown number sometimes referred to as "You Can't Chop Your Papa Up in Massachusetts," and finally, the subject of today's video, the rock opera simply entitled Lizzie. Lizzie is a very different portrayal of the Borden case. While usual retellings of events have a decently large cast encompassing victims, various suspects, police, and lawyers, Lizzie only boasts a cast of 4. These being the eponymous Lizzie, her older sister Emma, their neighbor and longtime friend Alice Russell, and the aforementioned maid Bridget Sullivan, referred to as Maggie by the sisters, the name of their previous maid, which is just rude. By honing in on these individuals, it focuses on the 4 women's specific dynamics and relationships, rather than the police investigations and court proceedings. Furthermore, while the story is still set in the 1890s, there's a lot of anachronistic choices, especially with the rock-heavy score and the cast stitching their period-accurate attire for punkier rock aesthetics in the second act. So, in short, we have a historically based musical with a small, fully female cast that leans on contemporary costumes and music with staging that more so resembles a girl group concert. Huh, where have I ever seen that before? Yes, the first few complete productions occurred long before 6 was a thing, so it's almost a shame the show didn't pop off before it, because now everyone that finds out about it will just say, wow, it's just like 6. Work on Lizzie actually started all the way back in the 90s, eventually leading to the 2-act show in 2009. But in all these iterations, the axe wielder in question has remained the same. The title character, Lizzie. That's not a big spoiler, by the way. The show is honest about that basically from the get-go. However, as opposed to a lot of other portrayals, her actions here are explained as a coming-of-age story, as described by Tim Maynard.
She has no way to express herself, feeling trapped, feeling like she doesn't have a way to express, and then she expresses herself.
However, while not everything portrayed here is necessarily accurate to real life, it also provides a very interesting historical perspective, as it takes retelling certain facts very seriously, oftentimes word for word, which places it in a very particular place in the Borden mythos. So why do we all assume Lizzie did it? What exactly is the truth? Finally, when it comes to a cutting-edge, mind-splintering, exciting retelling, does Lizzie manage to hatch it? Let's get into it and find out. The show opens with, what else? The famous nursery rhyme, ominously setting the stage for the events to follow. We're formally introduced to the four ladies. To recap, these are Alice Russell, who's Lizzie's friend, Bridget Sullivan, maid to the Borden household, Emma Borden, Lizzie's older sister, and Lizzie herself. We're then told of troublesome life in the Borden household, including the complete disconnect between the sisters and the elder Bordens, Father Andrew and stepmother Abby. Emma's particular hatred of her stepmother, Andrew being rich but too cheap to give the family a decent life, and him apparently loving Lizzie a bit too much. We then flash to an intimate moment with Lizzie lamenting on her life, where she explains how tortured she feels by her father's inappropriate relationship with her, and how desperate she is to find somewhere and someone to fly to.
Sometimes you say the words, but this is not love.
In a frenzied state, she bumps into her neighbor and close friend, Alice Russell, exclaiming she desperately needs to get away from her family. Alice is quickly left on her own, lamenting that she loves Lizzie, but can never tell her. Lizzie heads to the barn in the backyard of the family house to find comfort in the pigeons the family keeps. While her father finds them disgusting, she finds kinship with them in her desire to fly away. Overtaken by despair, Lizzie nearly jumps from the barn, but is stopped by Alice, who talks to her of hope for the future. The two fall asleep in an embrace, only to be woken up by her sister Emma in a screaming match with her stepmom Abby.
What our father does for your people, he ought to be doing for his own daughters.
Emma explains to Lizzie that their stepmom has convinced their father to cut them out of his will. She says she has to leave for Fairhaven as she's afraid that somebody would do something if she stayed. Lizzie suggests in desperation,
"What if Mrs. Borden dies first?"
which prompts Emma to think about the promise she'd made to their biological mom about keeping Lizzie safe, and now she's afraid she's failed. Regardless, Emma leaves the house. As she leaves, however, Bridget explains that Emma forgot to take her book, the Book of Household Poisons, which we can only assume Emma has left on purpose for Lizzie.
Time for Mrs. Borden's tea.
Catching on to the idea, Lizzie heads out to get some prussic acid, aka hydrogen cyanide, with the excuse that it is for cleaning a stain on his sealskin coat. On her way out, however, she stumbles into Alice and comes up with a cover story that she's going to Benz's pharmacy as everyone in the house had been sick, and Abby had told the family doctor that she felt someone was poisoning them. Even though Alice somewhat doubts the likelihood of this, the heightened emotions between the two lead to them finally kissing. A tender moment interrupted by Bridget, with the bad news that Andrew, frustrated at Lizzie for visiting the pigeons in the barn with Alice, has decapitated them all with an axe. Even though Alice begs Lizzie not to lose her temper, this is the straw that breaks her mind, and she makes her murderous choice as the stage is covered up with a conspicuous plastic sheet a la Dexter. The sequence of events follows as such. In the morning, Bridget goes to wash the windows on the outside of the house, Andrew goes out to town, and Abby cleans the guest bedroom. Seeing a golden opportunity, Lizzie finds an axe in the cellar, heads up to the bedroom, and as represented by her wailing on a pumpkin or watermelon on stage, brutally murders her. Bridget then tells Lizzie that Andrew has come back and is napping in the living room. Lizzie continues to set up cover stories, telling Bridget that Abby is away to visit a sick somebody that had left her a note, and bribing Bridget to go out and buy herself a new dress. A second pumpkin is hauled out, and Lizzie murders her father in his sleep. She then calls out to Bridget, saying somebody has come in and murdered her father, as Act 1 closes out. As the second act starts, we hear from Bridget that things are pretty wild right now, with the public and newspapers gathering to get a sight of the house and the police trudging about to investigate the case. Lizzie, on the other hand, has grown incredibly confident and nonchalant about it all. Even when Alice asks her what happened that day, she says she was simply hanging about in the barn, eating pears, looking for a lead sinker, which Alice questions due to the sheer heat that day.
20 minutes.
It must have been sweltering. I ate some pears.
The corpses are laid out in the dining room by the time Emma comes back from Fairhaven, and she has a very appropriate reaction to finding out Lizzie broke away from the original plan.
What the fuck? What the fuck now, Lizzie?
The next morning, Bridget blackmails Emma with the blood-stained dress Lizzie must have been wearing during the murders. This dress is a key piece of evidence in the case, particularly within the show itself. Emma pushes Lizzie to burn the dress, but on their way to do so, they bump into Alice, who the police are looking to interview. Nevertheless, the sisters go ahead with burning the dress, but Alice finds herself morally compelled to tell the police about it, despite Lizzie's passionate pleas for her not to do so. Regardless of their feelings towards each other, Alice betrays Lizzie. With this information, the police decide to charge Lizzie with the crime and bring her to Taunton jail. But not before the sisters make an announcement to the public that they are offering a $5,000 reward for anyone who helps bring the murder to justice.
Who occasioned the death of our father and his wife.
Lizzie goes to jail as the case against her is brought forward. We hear some of the more remarkable moments, including Lizzie letting her very expensive counsel speak for her, Emma being deliberately unclear in her answers, and Alice and Bridget giving pretty extensive answers. The burnt dress is a massive focus, with all three giving very inconsistent reports on it. After an hour of jury deliberations, the trial ends with a climactic not guilty verdict. The bittersweet conclusion of the story has the sisters getting away with it, even though they are now forever shrouded in rumors, and Alice and Lizzie will never be together. The show concludes with a full-on concert-style ending, with Lizzie celebrating her freedom, now finally able to fly away. There is a lot to love here, but also a lot to question. Teetering between manic and understated, Lizzie is characterized here as a generally unstable but hopeful character. Emma's portrayal, directly inspired by Lady Macbeth, as manipulative and commandeering as a breath of fresh air, as retellings often have her as a sister who's completely oblivious to Lizzie's machinations. Bridget being a knowing witness is also fun, but she's a very flat character who mostly serves as Irish comic relief. Alice functions as the one person who sees something wrong with murder as a solution, so her presence is ultimately appreciated too. I think what's remarkable about this show is just how much of it is lifted from real-life testimonies. Some critics have said that the inclusion of all these historical facts actually clouds the story, but it's one of my favorite parts. We have a ton of phrases that appear basically verbatim here, such as
I want to sleep with my eyes half open, one eye open half the time.
Why haven't you? You had better. I would if I were you.
I don't know, but what somebody will do something.
Our father does for your people. He ought to be doing for his own daughters. Burn your thing on. Why are all these heads on?
The usage of these phrases throughout the piece help ground the show in some historical accuracy, or at least demonstrate that the creative team did their research. However, the show comes to the same conclusion as 99% of Borden media. Lizzie did it. From a storytelling perspective, this makes sense. No one's coming to a Lizzie Borden musical expecting her not to be the killer. It just wouldn't be as cathartic if some rando did it. Still, as stated by Bill James in Popular Crime, it is nearly impossible to see how Lizzie Borden could have committed this crime. Yet, as he himself admits, it is nearly impossible to see how anyone but Lizzie Borden could have committed this crime. But ultimately, I'd like to invite you, dear viewer, to take part in the jury today and decide for yourself whether you would have considered Lizzie guilty without reasonable doubt. Let's talk motive, means, and opportunity. According to the musical, the motives include, number 1, Andrew Borden being abusive, 2, him murdering Lizzie's pet pigeons, 3, him being a penny pincher despite all the money he has, 4, Abby wanting to cut the sisters out of the will, and 5, Lizzie being a lesbian. Keep in mind, a few of these are mentioned by Bridget in the opening song, clarifying that some say this, or I hear things on the street, which does allow for some flexibility when whether or not the events portrayed on stage are wholly accurate, but all of these are shown as true within the confines of the show itself. First things first, the suggestion of incest in the Borden case is nothing new. In fact, there was even a media hoax at the time that she was pregnant by her maternal uncle, John V. Morse. John Morse is an interesting character himself, who isn't included in the musical to any capacity, but his sudden appearance staying overnight in the guest bedroom the previous day made him a very potential suspect. We'll get back to him later. Now, Andrew Borden specifically is often shown as a sexual predator, such as the 75 and 2014 movies, implying there's been relations between him and Lizzie, and the 2018 movie having him as Bridget's tormentor instead. The ghost hunting TV show Ghost Adventures also suggested that Andrew was abusing Lizzie in their very serious investigations. However, there is no solid or even testimonial evidence of there being any abuse, particularly of that kind, in the Borden household. People bring up this possibility with the violent nature of his murder, and with the fact that he always wore a ring that Lizzie had given him rather than his wedding ring. This leaves us in a difficult position because there is no evidence of anything like this, but even if this did happen, there likely wouldn't be any evidence. What we can say is that the Borden household may have been an odd one, but taking this to the most extreme reasoning is kind of an extreme conclusion in and of itself. This motive is most often used when you want to make Lizzie a sympathetic killer. Similarly, the pigeons killed by him in the barn may not have been darling pets to Lizzie, but rather just livestock. She confirmed that her father did indeed kill them, either by wringing their necks or chopping their heads off, but her language is detached, though this may be her putting on an act, or another extenuating circumstance. It's also likely he murdered them not to punish Lizzie, but rather because of an earlier barn break-in, supposedly by neighborhood boys trying to get to the pigeons. We can definitely say, though, that Lizzie was an animal lover, confirmed by her later living on her own with 3 dogs, and helping fund the Animal Rescue League in Fall River. Her fortune still funding it to this day. However, on the less sympathetic side for reasons to murder one's father, we have the oft-discussed money question. This also connects to Abby's murder, but for Andrew specifically, it's often cited that he was a complete penny pincher, something the musical highlights, with him having Bridget cook and serve the same mutton for days on end, and as an undertaker, cutting off feet from corpses in order to fit them into cheaper caskets. His estate was worth around $7 million in modern currency, yet he seemed unwilling to move to the richer area or to give the house all the modern amenities. However, this reputation is not completely fair. Andrew actually provided his daughters with a sizable allowance, which was bigger than what he gave Abby. The house was done up to have central heating, and it had a downstairs bathroom. Not ideal, but regardless. He even funded a grand tour through Europe for Lizzie, and funded for Emma to go to a young lady seminary.
He was close in money matters, but I never asked him for anything that I wanted very much that I didn't get, though sometimes I had to ask 2 or 3 times.
Moreover, the bit about chopping up bodies is a media hoax that only cropped up after his death. The mutton thing is true though, as supposedly by the day of the murders, the mutton in the house was already 4 days old, but it was actually some swordfish that got the Borden sick. There are some small mentions in the musical of Lizzie wanting to live up in the richer Hill neighborhood and to have new dresses, but that's as far as it goes for greed being its own motive for murder. However, his tight-fistedness mixed with Abby's supposed hatred of his daughters is a big factor. Abby's difficult relationship with the sisters has a lot of ground for discussion. Even in Lizzie's police inquest testimony, she herself found it hard to define. However, there were consistent rumors of tension within the house, which many individuals involved with the family corroborated with, including Bridget, who confirmed that the sisters did not eat with their parents. When interrogated shortly after the murders, a policeman would refer to Abby as Lizzie's mother, only to be abruptly corrected by Lizzie that Abby was her stepmother.
She's not my mother!
And this reaction is part of the reason the police honed in on her as the main suspect. The stepmother versus mother debate is actually an interesting one, because Lizzie actually did call her mother up until 6 years prior, when Andrew paid for Abby's half-sister to outright buy the house her family had been staying in. Emma and Lizzie only found out about this from someone outside the household, and this perceived unequal treatment led to much bereavement within the house. At which point, Lizzie started calling Abby Mrs. Borden instead. To make up for it, he gave his deed to his father's former home to his daughters. This allowed them to collect rent for the next 5 years, and it was only a couple of weeks before the murder that he actually bought the deed back from them for $5,000. According to John Morse, Andrew was considering writing a will around a year before the murders, but no such thing was ever found. By all means, Abby and consequently her next of kin would end up with 1/3 of his fortune if he died. This may be enough to lead to murder, but it's not quite as dramatic as the musical and the 2018 movie make it out to be, where they'd been written out of the will. Now, I think there's an ethics question to be asked here about portraying the 2 victims of the case as completely offstage villains whose only characteristic is their violence and greed. Again, many retellings of the story have them characterized this way, the weirdest one being the 2018 movie, which has Abby acting generally okay to Lizzie, but then randomly being a bitch to her in the scene leading up to her death.
He won't forgive you. It won't be long before he sends you away.
But does having them not physically exist within the space make it better or worse? Is it fair for these two to be consistently portrayed as they are here, or is it passé to use these tropes to conduct sympathy towards Lizzie's potential murders? The South Korean production even had these two super evil looking portraits of them up, just to really push on this point. I mean, even if we're gonna go ahead with Lizzie being guilty, it doesn't mean they had to be awful people. There's been many cases in real life of daughters orchestrating their parents' murders with the simple intent of getting inheritance money or just being freer to do whatever they want, with Susan von Richthofen and Jennifer Cecilia Pan being two such cases just off the top of my head.
And with what little we have to actually suggest the victims were bad people, I guess the closest thing I could compare it to would be if in 2113, there was a musical about O.J. Simpson where his supposed victims were portrayed as like totally evil people who absolutely deserved it. Furthermore, perhaps we should highlight how much of a spectacle the Borden case is seen as. Like nowadays, you can go to the Borden house, which has become a B&B and museum, and stay overnight. Yearly reenactments happen, and you can even lay down in the spots where the victims died. Is there simply not enough empathy for these two? And is it fair to make Lizzie a victim just to justify her potential murder? I'm not going to get much deeper into this topic, but you guys let me know what you think down below. Finally, we have the idea of a lesbian Lizzie Borden and how this would have impacted the case. This is based on a couple of things. First off, Lizzie was in her mid-30s and still unmarried, which many people have attributed to the weird family dynamics. But even after the murders, Lizzie never did marry, although neither did Emma.
A letter Lizzie supposedly sent to a young woman where she stated she'd been dreaming of her in dreams she would not dare put to paper is also oftentimes used as evidence. Finally, there was her close relationship later in life with actress Nance O'Neill, speculated to be romantic by some at the time, as noted by Victoria Lincoln in A Private Disgrace, which was stated by Tim Maynard to be one of the sources for the show. The lesbian lover angle is a slightly more recent reasoning for Lizzie's fictionalized guilt. The 1984 novel and 2018 movies of the same name had her connecting to Bridget, portrayed by Kristen Stewart in the latter, which intersects with the motive for the murders as the two are caught in a tryst. And then obviously, we have Lizzie with Alice Russell here, though this isn't used as a direct motive. Much like with the other points, there is ultimately no proof of this, just speculation. While the two were indeed friends, Emma stated that they were not close friends, but rather just calling friends. The relationship added here mostly functions as a further layer to the betrayal by Alice, which is oftentimes just an asterisk in the other betrayals. So out of these 5 motivating factors, only around 2-ish have some grounding to them. Now, with all those motives being kind of left up in the air, we can move on to the means. What was used to commit this crime, and did Lizzie have access to it? When it comes to the weapon used, the musical only mentions it once. Quote,
I went down to the cellar and searched behind some sacks. My eyes, they never saw it, but my hands, they found the axe.
While the cellar is relevant here, forensic analysis of the time actually concluded that this was most likely a hatchet of some kind, and a new one at that. This is because the skull indents actually contained gilt metal, which is something that all hatchet heads have when they leave the factory, but it wears off with use. 2 hatchets found in that cellar were of particular note. One had hair on it and seemed to be blood-stained, but this was determined to not be human hair, and the stains were not actually blood. The other hatchet was even more interesting. Not only did the shape of the blade match the indentations on the victim's skulls, but it was also missing its wooden handle, which was suspicious, as blood would have been nigh impossible to wash off from wood, so removing and potentially burning the handle would have been the best way to hide evidence. However, a massive inconsistency between policemen on the stand ruined its validity, as one said the handle was in the same box, and another said it was nowhere to be found. The fact that this handle was potentially only missing due to police incompetence, plus the head not having any gilt metal or blood on it, ruined any potential of this being the murder weapon in the eyes of the jury. Furthermore, this specific hatchet was mass manufactured by the Underhill Edge Tool Company, meaning it would have been quite common, so really anyone could have had the means to carry this out. For all the talk about the burnt dress in the musical, it makes no evidence of how she got rid of the weapon used in the crime. But you may ask yourself, wasn't there poison used here? What was all that talk about poison if there's no poison?
Mrs. Borden,
R.I.P.
Simply put, while there was a sickness going around the house, and Abby did tell her doctor that she thought she was being poisoned, there was no prussic acid found in the victim's stomachs, and there was also no sign of irritation in them either. I tested Mr. Borden's stomach also for prussic acid with a negative result. There was no evidence of any irritant poison having been in the stomach at all, no irritation. There is no other ordinary poison which would prove fatal immediately. That was the only one I considered it necessary to test for, under the circumstances.
In the musical, Lizzie seemingly never gets as far as Bence's pharmacy, being interrupted by Alice on her way, but in real life, 3 witnesses, including Eli Bence himself, stated they'd seen Lizzie coming into the pharmacy the morning prior to the murder, saying she needed prussic acid to clean her sealskin cape. She was refused the acid and left frustrated.
Keep in mind that the elder Bordens were actually sick the night before the whole pharmacy incident, so it's possible that they were poisoned with something weaker before, something that wouldn't have left any kind of irritation marks in their stomachs. While an extremely damning situation for Lizzie, seemingly only Bence came forward to testify. And unfortunately for the prosecution, this testimony was actually excluded from court. This is because the judge felt that it had little bearing in the case since the victim seemingly hadn't been poisoned, and because Lizzie never once made a statement about wanting to use poison specifically to target her parents.
I mean, could it kill a pet? Quite a large pet? A sort of almost person-sized pet? What would it do to, say, a 50-year-old woman?
I mean, in a small dose.
Would it dissolve her stomach and make her lungs bleed until she drowned?
Finally, the talk she has with Alice at that point in the show is also based on truth, as Lizzie confided in her the night before the murders that the family had been sick. However, in real life, she also added that there'd been 2 break-ins, that she'd heard her father arguing over property with an unknown man, and that she'd seen a figure skulking around outside the house. Again, it's all shown to be hogwash from Lizzie in the musical, but reality is somehow even stranger.
Finally, we have the question of who would have had the opportunity to carry this out. The musical never brings in the idea that someone else could have done it, particularly someone outside of its very tiny cast, but I would like to highlight here how extremely difficult it would have been for someone who didn't know that house inside and out to carry this out.
If it was someone who wasn't supposed to be in the house, such as an intruder, this individual would have entered the house by the side door, murdered Abby, stayed out of sight for around 90 minutes between the murders, ensuring no one came upstairs to find her body, murdered Andrew, and then exited the property without any witnesses. This is, to say the least, a hard task, and it may reduce the suspect list to around 4 people: Lizzie, Bridget, Emma, and John Morse. Lizzie was honed in early, being the first to see Andrew's body and due to her suspicious behavior, which may have spared Bridget from being further investigated. This may have been a mercy, seeing as she, as an Irish immigrant maid, could have very easily been made suspect number 1. She also did talk to a neighbor's maid and was actually spotted cleaning windows by another neighbor, so that helped clear her from direct involvement. Though we mostly rely on her testimony to provide a timeline, so any lies on her part and the whole order of things could get really messy. Emma, on the other hand, was staying in Fairhaven at the time, 15 miles away. While the people she was visiting could not state whether she'd been in their direct sight the whole morning, the timeline would have needed to be quite tight to put her in contention.
Similarly, John Moore supposedly met his niece and nephew on the other side of Fall River at 9:30 a.m., around the very specific time Abby would have likely been murdered. Although we can question whether or not that household's testimonies are trustworthy, Morse did claim he took a streetcar alongside 6 priests on the way there, which is something that was substantiated by another streetcar driver that passed by them, even though he couldn't confirm whether or not he'd seen Morse specifically. I suppose 6 priests sitting with you is as good an alibi as any. In comparison to all these somewhat substantiated alibis, Lizzie provided at the police inquest an extremely bizarre testimony. She kept changing whether she was upstairs or downstairs when her father first arrived, aka when Abby was already dead upstairs. He came home after I came downstairs.
You were not upstairs when he came home.
I was not upstairs when he came home, no sir.
1 minute later.
Where were you when the bell rang?
I think in my room upstairs.
Then you were upstairs when your father came home.
I don't know for sure, but I think so.
And then she gave a convoluted alibi of being in the barn for the time that Andrew was murdered, searching for lead to make a sinker while eating 3 pears for around 20 minutes.
To look in that box that you have described the size of on the bench and put down the curtain and then get out as soon as you conveniently could. Would you say you were occupied in that business 20 minutes?
I think so, because I did not look at the box when I first went up.
What did you do?
I ate my pears.
Stood there eating the pears, doing nothing.
I was looking out the window.
Stood there looking out of the window, eating the pears.
I should think so.
This testimony is referenced somewhat in the show, illustrated as outright unbelievable lies, and the aforementioned pears are included in basically all the trailers for productions for Lizzie. She also mentioned in this testimony the fight regarding Abby's sister's house, which provided a potential motive for the police to look into.
You have been on pleasant terms with your stepmother since then.
Yes, sir.
Cordial?
It depends upon one's idea of cordiality, perhaps.
According to your idea of cordiality.
We were friendly. Very friendly.
Cordial, according to your idea of cordiality.
Quite so.
What do you mean by quite so?
Quite cordial.
Keep in mind that she'd been prescribed morphine by the family doctor from the day of the murders, increased to a double dosage from the day following, up to her release from jail. So perhaps that could explain some of the bizarreness here. You try giving a testimony while high on shock and morphine.
Additionally, the media storm must have been a major source of anxiety for Lizzie. And the only actual written version of this testimony that we have nowadays is something that was provided by the media, so it's hard to say how conclusively accurate that is.
Fortunately for her, the defense team was able to get this thrown out of court, as the judge felt she had not been given adequate legal counsel leading up to it. While this was good for Lizzie, Bridget's testimony didn't help her any, as it definitely made her seem suspicious, noting she was upstairs when her father came in and seems to have slightly pushed for Bridget to leave the house when he was going to get murdered.
However, as insanely weird as Lizzie's testimony might be, if Bridget is telling the truth, there would have only been 20 minutes between her last seeing Andrew and Lizzie calling her down after he'd been murdered. Would Lizzie really have had time to kill him, clean herself up, and get rid of the murder weapon? So what could Lizzie have been wearing in order for her not to get any blood on her? Considering the discussion of the dress in the musical basically takes up half of Act 2, this really is as contentious an issue as it is portrayed there. What she was wearing that morning is honestly an old-timey gold or blue dress situation because no one could tell definitive details of that dress. Amidst all the commotion, Alice had actually tried to loosen the collar of Lizzie's dress as she seemed faint, but Lizzie stopped her. She would later head upstairs and change into what we know is a pink and white wrapper dress. And when asked to provide what she was wearing when she found the bodies, Lizzie provided a blue skirt and blouse. However, as I've mentioned, no one who saw her that morning, particularly before the police arrived, could provide much definitive insight into what she was wearing, other than it was likely blue. I had on a navy blue, sort of a Bengaline silk skirt with a navy blue blouse. I couldn't tell what dress the girl had on. It was loose here when I started to unloosen them. That is the only thing about the dress I noticed. It looked like a light blue and white groundwork. It seemed like calico or cambric. It was an ordinary, unattractive, common dress that I did not notice especially. I thought she had a light blue dress with a bosom in the waist, or something like a bosom. I thought there was a small figure on the dress, a little spot-like. A white dress with a waist with blue material, a white spray running through it. Nevertheless, we do know that the dress that Lizzie burned was a blue cotton dress that had been purchased that spring. The musical even specifically shows Alice being asked if Lizzie was wearing a blue dress that morning, and if she changed into a different one.
What did she wear? Was it stained at the hem? Did she change into another one?
Regarding the burning of the dress, Alice saw Lizzie over the kitchen stove with the dress, which Alice confirmed was not visibly bloodstained, but rather stained with green paint, and she heard Lizzie saying to Emma that she'd be burning it. While Alice didn't see the actual burning, she'd later see Lizzie tearing apart of the dress later. Afterwards, when Alice was asked by a private detective whether all the dresses from the house from the day of the murders were still around, she answered yes.
Quickly realizing her mistake, she told the sisters she'd lied and supposedly at their insistence confessed to the police about it. This did in fact lead to Lizzie getting arrested. Alice then failed to mention the Borden dress in her first examination before the grand jury, which led to her getting recalled to give this testimony. This then led to Lizzie being indicted for the murders. It was at this point that the relationship between the remaining Bordens and Alice was completely destroyed.
Many witnesses confirmed that they did not see any blood on Lizzie the day of the murders. The following day, when police looked over Lizzie, they only found a small smidge of blood on her underskirt. This, plus the pail of bloody rags that they found in the cellar, were both attributed to her menstrual cycle. This was confirmed by both Lizzie and the family doctor. As police women were not a thing back then, and men were probably just as uncomfortable talking about it as they are now, the police just took it as that. A lot of retellings actually take this to mean that she was naked when she committed the murders, meaning she could have washed the blood off and not have had to stain any dress. Other common theories include her wearing her father's coat, the one that his body had been found resting on, and her potentially wearing the blue dress, murdering their parents, and then putting another dress on top of it. But again, no proof of any of these possibilities. Since all pieces of evidence that could have been used against Lizzie were basically thrown out the window by the time they reached the end of the trial, prosecution decided to focus on that sick note that Abby had been supposedly sent. They highlighted how suspicious it was that it was never found, even though Lizzie very much stuck by her story that she had been sent a sick note. Regardless of this last-ditch attempt, the jury still found Lizzie not guilty. The various pieces of missing evidence, plus the time-related beliefs that a woman of Lizzie's stature could never have done such a crime, left the prosecution's case quite weak. I myself don't know if I could have said that she was guilty without reasonable doubt. I mean, even if she had motive, means, and opportunity, that doesn't mean she did do it. And regardless of their alibis, the possibility that Bridget, Emma, or John Morse were involved should be highlighted. I mean, the musical itself states that Emma and Bridget are aware of it, even if they aren't the axe wielders. While Emma obviously did have something to gain here, Bridget did get paid by Lizzie's lawyer after the trial to return to Ireland, and supposedly received an even larger sum of money from Lizzie. John Morse also could have been involved, but we don't know if he had anything to gain from it. And honestly, if Lizzie did do it and had an accomplice, you'd have thought the team would have thought up of a better alibi than being up in the barn eating 3 pears for 20 minutes. There also is the potential for another party to have been hired in to do the deed, but then you'd have someone drenched in blood, bloody hatchet in hand, running around the streets at 11 a.m. And that just seems unlikely.
Ultimately, we will likely never know the details behind the murder of Abby and Andrew Borden. The 4 women in this musical would all go their own ways. Bridget would eventually move from Ireland to Montana, and on her deathbed, spoke of having helped Lizzie during her trial, but offered no further details. Alice would tell her cousins that she felt Lizzie was guilty of the crime, but took any other possible information about the Borden family to the grave. Finally, Emma and Lizzie would move to a more modern house in the Hill neighborhood of Fall River shortly after the trial, where the wealthier families lived, and the latter would start going by Lizbeth. The sisters would have a massive falling out in 1905, leading to Emma moving away. Even though they'd become estranged, Emma still professed her sister's innocence. Lizbeth would live a mostly quiet life from this point, until she passed away from pneumonia on the 19th of June, 1927. Only 9 days later, Emma would also pass away from natural causes, being buried alongside her sister. The musical stands as an interesting piece of the Borden story. It's very deliberate in its inclusion of quotes in verbatim, using them to paint the case in a very vivid manner, but also building up the story to hone in on Lizzie as the definitive killer. It carefully constructs the scenario to demonstrate she's a woman pushed to her edge by all of those around her, finding her liberation in the bloodiest way possible. As stated by notable Lizzie Borden scholar Stephanie Corey, Lizzie Borden is whomever we wish or need her to be.
And out of the sympathetic murderer Lizzie Borden stories, this is definitely one to experience.
But we should always be mindful that just because something represents a good nonfiction story doesn't mean it's reality.
especially if it has a bunch of Victorian women becoming rock superstars by the end.
If you have any interest in the musical, please do check out the album, which will undoubtedly be on my Spotify Wrapped this year. And if you want to know more about the real case, please do give a read to The Borden Murders by Sarah Miller or The Trial of Lizzie Borden by Cara Robertson. You've also got LizzieAndrewBorden.com, as well as its sister forum, which is filled with aficionados and interesting information. I'm also going to pin a big comment in the comments section explaining a lot of other details about the case that I just couldn't fit in here, otherwise this video would have killed me. And if you're still here, thank you so much for watching. Please do check out our other videos, like, comment, subscribe, and let us know of any other historical musicals that you want us to look at next. Thank you so much.